Okay, I think we are actually live.
All right.
Hooray. If anybody is watching at this point, we're not going to actually start the tutorial until it's 10 a.m. Eastern time. So in like 3 minutes. But yeah, I don't know. We can sit silently for the next 3 minutes or whatever you all want to do. Maybe, Obina, you can tell us about the conference you're at.
Yeah, that's exciting. That is the cool stuff. Is it a one-day conference? Woo!
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So have you been to this one before, Obina? Oh, wow. Yep. Very cool. And what did you said you had to give a talk at the last minute? What did you just talk about, like Gatsby or? Um, oh, wow. Nice.
Way cool.
All right. So we got one more minute. Oh, we have 13 people watching now. Hello, 13 people. Nice to see you.
Maybe 13 incognito windows of Twitch
Yeah.
open. My mom.
Yeah, and for those of you who are listening, we will have time for questions like periodically, and Obina's gonna take the lead on taking questions from chat to feed to Kyle. So if you do have any questions, the chat is a good place for them. Yeah, well, it is 10 a.m. Eastern time, so Kyle, whenever you want to get started,
Yeah, let's just go ahead and get started then, since I guess it's going to be recorded anyway. All right, well, let's jump in. We have kind of boring, but we got slides to present what we got going on here. So my name's Kyle. We're here with Obina. Say hi, Obina.
Hi, guys.
We're both members of the Gatsby Learning team. To this webinar tutorial is on this topic, adding components to a blog with MDX. You may have heard of MDX. You may not know what it is. You may know what it is already. You may have used it, but we're going to try and cover all of our bases, talk about what it is, why you'd use it, and then exactly how you'd implement it in code in a Gatsby site. So the learning team, to introduce ourselves a little bit, to give a little background, is to improve the learning experience for users of all skill levels, all experience levels, whatever background they're coming from. The goal is to help everyone learn Gatsby well and be able to approach it from, I don't know, wherever they're coming from. Doesn't matter whatever background. We hope that we can make things easy enough or approachable enough for beginners, as well as configurable enough for those that have more experience. So that's kind of the goal and kind of what we hope to achieve teaching stuff like this as well. We have an upcoming webinar on e-commerce, and then we'll have more live streams and content sort of like this so that we can get more learning content in more mediums and formats for people that are learning. That's an exciting one, but also important, follow along with the 100 Days of Gatsby challenges that are happening. Those have been happening since the start of the year. There's one a week. I think we're on week 8 now. This week's challenge is making sure that the images and forms on your site are accessible. We're actually going to look a little bit at that in today's webinar, in addition to MDX. They can kind of overlap in some places. So follow along with that if you want to keep learning Gatsby or want to jump in, you can jump in whenever. And then also be sure to share what you're building or working on Twitter with this hashtag built with Gatsby, or follow the hashtag 100 Days of Gatsby on Twitter as well. And there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of fun interactions with the community. So look forward to seeing you there. So to kind of jump into the content of what we want to talk about and what makes MDX special, interesting to use, and kind of a cool idea, starts with kind of introducing what Markdown is. If you're unfamiliar, Markdown is this it's like a file type that you'll see. There's .md files you may have run into in repositories like readme.md. Markdown is essentially this authorable format that was made to be easy to write, but also look good when rendered live on a site or in different locations. So you can see in this kind of simple little contrived example, if this file called like datastory.markdown, we'd be able to write in a way that is kind of quick to type out. By putting a hashtag, you denote that this would be an H1 tag in HTML, or like a title of your site, and a header one. By just writing regular text, stuff is output as a paragraph. 2 hashtags makes a secondary subheader, more paragraphs, and then you can even render images and provide alt text to them, stuff like that. So it makes it easier to write what you want quicker, but then rendered, it looks something kind of like this would end up. So you can see that a title would end up getting like bigger styling, would be wrapped in the proper tags, and this could actually be displayed like on a website, for example. So we have a paragraph that kind of gets mapped to its respective HTML elements, but it's easy for us to write, is kind of the important concept. You can see things like this where if we have some sort of chart or graphic, we can actually render that whole thing. But this is cool and it's neat, but there's a bit of a limitation that we can kind of break open with MDX, and that's what we kind of want to exemplify. So in this little example, if we look at an MDX file, we have nearly the same looking content where you have titles, paragraphs, subheaders, more text. But this one key distinction that MDX allows us to do is to actually import components like React components or little pieces of the web that we want to include in the documents we're authoring. So in this case, we're importing this chart and then writing the chart out like an HTML tag, essentially like you would do in a React site. And then when it's rendered, you actually get this live interactive component. The beauty of this is rather than this static image, you have the ability to add like filters and neat sorting or highlighting specific parts. It allows whoever's reading this to kind of dive into the data. And this is just an example of a chart. Whatever components you add can be interactive and can use JavaScript to kind of aid the learning experience or the reading experience in neat ways. So that's what we are actually going to end up doing today, is adding a chart into a blog post to show how it could be interactive, kind of mimic what this experience is like. So to get started, we have there's a GitHub repo with all of the steps we're going to be walking through that's set up. We could actually link to these slides in the Twitch chat so that you can see these resources here, link to them. If you go to the GitHub repo, these slides are also linked there. And we have some other additional resources, like if you're interested in converting an existing Gatsby site to use MDX, and right now you're using Markdown, there's some resources for doing that. Documentation on plugins we'll be using, and different docs that Gatsby has on MDX in general, as well as the live site and other stuff we'll be working with. So with that kind of introduction, we'll start diving into code so we're not just stuck here looking at slides. So I've got an existing like base version of the Gatsby default starter pulled up here. So this is my repository in VS Code open. This actually I can get by, if you run Gatsby new, if you have the Gatsby command line tools installed, and you were to just choose any default project and choose the default starter, what I have right now matches that. So we can look around in like our file tree here. There's a Gatsby config. outlining some specific plugins that the default starter uses. We've got a pages folder with a home page, a page 2, a 404 page, and some components. So we'll run Gatsby develop just to see and show that we actually are at this base level. I'm doing this from our repository that we created, the same one linked in these slides. So if you go to that repository, I'm starting out from the very first step in our numbered branches. That's kind of outlined in the README for this repository. So once I run this site, we should just be seeing the Gatsby default starter if I go to localhost 8000. So yeah, default starter, go to page 2. It's possible you've seen this before if you've ever made a Gatsby site. If not, if this all looks really foreign, the Gatsby tutorial is great at kind of getting you up to speed on setting up this environment and running one of these sites for the first time. But we want to start extending this to start adding the plugins we need to use MDX and start writing our own pages using MDX. So in order to do that, we extend Gatsby most frequently using plugins. And there's actually a plugin already configured by members of the Gatsby team to set up pieces of MDX for you so that it's a really simple process. It's essentially installing a plugin and then getting the things you need. So in order to do that, we just need to install Gatsby Plugin MDX. So I'm going to pull up the documentation on this because I pretty much always do this when I'm installing anything. So we take a look at kind of what this is doing. We've got an explanation of why MDX, but then these installation steps are exactly what I need. So I want to install Gatsby Plugin MDX, and then there's also some other dependencies that the MDX plugin requires in order to run. That's MDX.js and MDX.js for React. These are just kind of doing additional things behind the scenes, so we need to make sure we copy all of this. So I'm going to turn off this build, and then I'm going to paste that command, npm install Gatsby Plugin MDX, MDX.js, MDX.js React. So this may take a minute, but when I'm installing this, this will add Gatsby Plugin MDX and these two dependencies to my package.json file, and then I'll be able to start using this plugin in my site. So plugins are the common way of extending Gatsby, and they allow different authors of plugins to write additional functionality that hooks into what Gatsby does when it runs the site. So with that installed, by adding this plugin into my Gatsby config, next to all these other plugins that are already installed, is how I start getting the behavior for Gatsby Plugin MDX. So there's two ways of installing plugins. We can actually look at examples here in our existing Gatsby config. You can add a plugin to this plugins array inside of our config with just a string with the plugin's name, which will add the plugin using default options. Or we can add our plugin to our site as an object with these keys to resolve it with its name and then providing options. So that allows an easier way of getting set up by just adding Gatsby Plugin MDX. I get default functionality. If I want to extend it to have some specific options, customize it for my site, I would write it in this way. So we're actually going to do that so that I can add a couple things that we're going to need in a minute. So if I kind of mimic what's up here, I need to say resolve Gatsby Plugin MDX, and then we need to pass in some options. And we'll take a look back at these docs to see exactly what it allows us to add using those options. So there's example there. They're adding Gatsby Plugin MDX with default options. We're going to keep scrolling down to see, okay, configuration. So Gatsby Plugin MDX exposes a configuration API to kind of extend it, add different things like MDX extensions, layouts, global scope. Some of those words may mean to you might not make a lot of sense right now, and that's okay. The default options are generally enough for a lot of cases. But I want to point out one configuration in particular, and that's these default layouts. So if we take a look at our site as it was running, we have this layout around our site that we want kind of on every page. This header component is across every page. There's this footer with some kind of metadata information about our site. And we want that to be on every page, and we don't want to have to import that and copy that onto every page over and over again. So in the Gatsby default starter, if you actually look at it, there's this layout component that we've got there. It's wrapping every single page in our header, like we just saw. It's wrapping it into this footer, like we saw. And then it's putting everything else like kind of in the middle, in the body of that page. So we essentially want to do this same thing for MDX, and we want to say like, okay, let's use this same layout and wrap what we're writing in MDX, and so that we can have this consistent header and footer and whatever content we may have on our site across every page. So we're going to do the same thing, and let's take a look at these docs and see what they tell us about adding these. So adding default layouts means it takes an object where the key is the name, and then the path to the component is what it takes. So we're going to copy this kind of exact same structure here. We're going to say default layouts. Then we need to say our default layout is going to be coming from a file path at what place? The same place as our layout component here. Source, components, layout.js. Okay. So with that done, when we restart our server running Gatsby Develop, we should start seeing any files that we add with an MDX extension should start getting picked up by this plugin. Since we don't have any, we wouldn't see that. So let's go ahead and add one now. We'll say my first post.mdx. And we'll just add some really generic content here. Let's go. Now when I run Gatsby Develop again, we'll hopefully start seeing a new page show up wrapped by our layout component. To explain what happens kind of right here, when we run Gatsby Develop, we see a bunch of stuff get logged out like this. Success, open and validate Gatsby config. Success, load plugins. So Gatsby, every time you run it, will run through these series of like build steps to make sure that all the plugins, all the features they're trying to add get run. So Gatsby Plugin MDX is actually doing stuff in several of these steps. In certain places, like right here, there's this step where Gatsby will create pages. Since our Gatsby Plugin MDX internally was written to create pages for us, it'll kind of be involved in that process too. So once we have this running, we can take a look and see if it actually worked. Let's go pull up the site again. And since all pages in this pages directory are automatically created by Gatsby, we should be able to navigate to a route / my first post, and we should see this. So let's go ahead and try that. My first post. Okay. So like expected, we see that content from our MDX file. Pretty basic. It's pretty simple. I mean, it's small in content so far, so there's not a whole lot there. But we have some pretty interesting functionality here. We already have this wrapped in our layout, so it looks just like another piece of the site. And we'll be able to begin adding components here. So I'm not sure if there's any questions popping up in the chat. Ben, have you seen anything or anything you think we should address?
No questions so far, but
Okay,
please
great.
ask questions.
Yeah, feel free if something's confusing.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the initial step of kind of configuring and setting up MDX. That's probably like a 3-step process. You're installing this plugin, you're making sure you add it to your config, and then from there, just kind of creating MDX files. So to explain a little more what this plugin is doing, like this create pages step says, it's looking through our site for the Gatsby MDX plugin is looking through our site for any file that ends in .mdx. When it finds those, it says, all right, we've got an MDX file here. Let's make sure we deal with this. There's some things we know we need to do, and we'll create a page from that. And then there's some other steps, like making sure that if there's components in these files, it knows what to do with them. So let's get started and kind of see what can be done with MDX then. We have some content here, but this is no different than just regular generic Markdown. So it'd be neat to start adding some components into this, to add something that can make the experience of reading richer. So to give some examples of what this can do, it gets particularly interesting when we realize that with MDX we can create this interactive content in what used to sort of be static content. Like recalling this this example in these slides, the Markdown content is generally pretty static. There's not a lot you really do or interact with here. But when we start adding this interactivity, things can kind of become interesting. It opens up some like real creativity. So as an example of this, we actually have a blog post that Sam Bogwat wrote. There's actually several examples in the Gatsby blog because our Gatsby docs and the blog, they all use MDX, and that gives us some interesting opportunities. We're going to show off a couple of them. So for example, on this site, we actually have very similar to this example we've been talking about, this interactive chart right here in the middle of the blog content. So here's our layout like we see in our little example site we're building. We have a header. This is across all pages on the Gatsby docs and the blog. But then in here, Sam wrote this content in MDX. And at a certain point, it's possible Sam says, oh, you know, this is interesting. This would be cool to show some sort of visualization of the rise of smartphone usage. So he could add this chart. If he added it as an image, we wouldn't be able to really hover over, see these tooltips, kind of explore this data in interesting ways. So we're going to add something similar to this in our blog, add our own little chart, add some data, and see what can make it interactive. So I looked through a couple charting libraries. We'll use one in particular. It's called React Charts. Let me pull up a link to that. There's nothing that makes this library any more special than another one in regards to adding it with MDX. I just found a charting library that I thought would have a component that was exported that we could import. So there's several examples of charts on React Charts website. To kind of go along with what we had in these slides, we're going to add a bar chart. So looking through here, I took this chart and then kind of removed some of these pieces of extraneous info in this example. And we'll use kind of a simplified version of this chart and add it into the MDX here. So in order to do this, with MDX installed and configured, it's really becomes now importing components and then including the tags for those components. So we can go back into our MDX file, and then at the top of a file, we can import a chart from React Charts. However, I'm actually going to need to install React Charts if I want to use anything from it. So let's make sure I do that first by running npm install React Charts. Then once that's done, I'll be able to import components from this third-party library without writing any code, get this neat interactivity like we can see here with tooltips and some more level of granularity that a user can kind of take advantage of while reading. So it looks like that run and should be okay. So importing a chart from React Charts, that means we can now really just render a chart. But we need to provide some different props and add some data. So rather than figuring that all in front of you, I'm just going to copy this little example I have elsewhere. So replacing that with this big thing. So as you can see, we have a chart. There's really nothing too special to MDX here. This is just passing in props for this React component. If you refer to the React chart docs, this would all make sense. Some other things that are interesting to note or important to note, we're wrapping this chart in a figure element, which is the HTML element for denoting images, diagrams, or charts. And then we're also adding this figure caption, explaining sort of what the chart is trying to tell us. So if I'm to save this file and then we kick up our site again by running Gatsby develop, now when the plugin starts running, it's going to find our MDX file, my first post, look through our content here and say, oh, they've got this chart component. Let's make sure we know how to deal with that. If we go back over to the site and refresh, or not even refresh, it's already there, we have this chart. And on the chart, we have the ability to hover and see these tooltips. And we can get specific data about each bar in this chart, rather than just an image of the chart. So we're kind of starting to replicate this behavior over here. And this kind of gets exciting when you realize that all of these props passed into this chart, passed in through React, they operate the same way that React apps operate. So we can modify these props and these things will update live. We could go back to our code and adjust some of these props. We could switch out the data for new data if we wanted to see new things. We could change the type of the chart. We could update information like how these bars are stacked and show them side by side instead. And we can make all of these controls live inside of our content here so that whoever's reading this that wants to see maybe this data in new ways has the ability to do so rather than just whatever we see. That's where I think this idea with MDX starts to get really powerful. This opens up neat ways of creating richer experiences, reading content that is generally could be kind of dry. So if we added like some sort of switch up here, maybe some toggle that just toggles this stacked prop, false and true, that gives the user the ability to kind of see the data how they want to. Let's see, any questions up to this point? Am I missing anything in this chat? Hopefully not. We're doing okay over here? Cool. It looks like a couple other charts being linked. Neat. Yeah, if there's better charts, I'm definitely open to suggestions. I just found any old one I could. Let's see. To jump back into this. So that's adding a chart, adding our third-party component, importing in our site. We haven't really written any React code, but we're already starting to get the benefits of what it can add us. I suppose we wrote a little bit adding this, adding props for this chart. But another interesting use case is starting to jump into custom components, things that maybe a developer in-house or internal or that you yourself have written or worked on. So this is coming from another person's library. That's great. Let's look at what it would take to add our own custom component and render that inside of here. So for a couple examples of this is something that Gatsby does in several places in our docs and in the blog as well. One example is this, we have a pull quote component, as we call it. Let's pull up my Chrome again, bring down this window. So here's an example on a docs page. This doc's on adding app and website functionality. It's just essentially adding neat app features to Gatsby sites. And inside it, to introduce this topic, there's this little quote from Dustin, who's a member of the Gatsby team, about how apps and websites and apps and their functionalities are merging more and more and more, and how what makes an app or a site is kind of harder to distinguish nowadays. And in order to draw more attention to that content, we have this component that just wraps this text and then renders it in a neater, prettier way to show that this is indeed a quote. Another example we have from more of a learning perspective is this, what we've kind of dubbed this layer model component. So in certain docs on the Gatsby docs, this one is GraphQL concepts, helping explain how GraphQL and Gatsby overlap. If you've never heard of GraphQL, and this is your first introduction to Gatsby, this is a great doc to refer to kind of start to understand some of these technologies. We have several conceptual guides like this. And in order to help explain how Gatsby operates, how it runs, what it's actually doing, we built this component to show different steps as Gatsby takes your content, builds it, makes it queryable data, then becomes React components, and then is rendered live on a website. And then we added this component to specific pages where we're sort of explaining the similar content. And this is all just a React component that can be embedded inside of MDX. So in the middle of the content reading, you can begin to see, as you're trying to learn about GraphQL, like, okay, here's GraphQL. This is kind of what I'm learning from this. And then see, all right, this is how GraphQL relates to what I'm doing in Gatsby. And then explore this and say, okay, what happens before this step? What happens after this step? And you're able to explore what you need and not be forced to, I don't know, kind of look into what you don't need. So I think this is a really interesting example as well of something you can add to start making this experience richer for users. So in our case, we're going to add a simple, well, maybe not simple, but a custom component that's just a few lines of code. In our case, that'll be a form. This actually goes along with the 100 Days of Gatsby challenge this week, adding an accessible form. We want to make sure that forms are accessible and that somewhere in our content here, we're rendering something that a user could sign up to read more. If we continue writing some content in here, more content about our neat blog post. Let's add a call to action. Maybe we're getting to a point where the user is excited and they want to sign up to know more. It's very possible they don't, but we could add a little form right in here in line with the rest of our content, like you may have seen on other blogs or other places. It says, hey, if you're interested in reading more about this, feel free to sign up. We can add that right in line. So in order to add a custom component, we write a component like we would for any other React component, and then import it into our MDX and render it just like we did this chart. So I'm going to create a new file called form.js and then just start writing. So we'll import React. From React, this says we're just using React, and then create a function called form. My shift key is not working. Then we need to return something from this function that we'll actually want to render. In our case, that's a form. So inside the form, we'll probably want to just show an email, and then we'll show a sign up button. So in order to do that, we need to add an input of type email, and we'll name it email. Now, an important part to this is if we have an input, we should also add a label to make sure that screen readers and those actually using this form know, okay, what is this input telling us? What content is there? So we're going to wrap this whole thing in a label. Whoops, we need to put that on the other side here at the end. And then we'll say that this is our email field. And by wrapping it this label will know that, okay, this input is associated with this label. I'm going to save that. And then this won't render correctly. So we need to replace this with an input of type submit, which will render a little submit button for our form. And we'll just for now say value submit. This will create a little label that says email, an input field that someone can add their email to, and an input button that allows them to submit the form. We would also add a post method or some sort of place that this form would send data to, but for now we won't actually implement that because that could be many different services or backends. But we have several guides on the Gatsby docs about adding forms, specifically sign-up forms like this, and what you would add to this form in order to send this information somewhere you want to save it or store it, like for an email list. So we have this form. Now, in order to use it elsewhere in a React component, we need to export it so that we can import it in other places. So we'll export default form. I will save this file and then head back over to the MDX file. Then here I should now be able to just say import form from our components folder, form.js. And then I will go down to the bottom of my content where we started saying let's add a call to action and put the little form tag there. Keep reading. Now when I save, we have this form with our label, an input, and a submit button. That's a important part of accessibility is keyboard accessibility for users that aren't using a mouse. So if I'm clicking through my screen and I can see that this input actually is navigatable with the keyboard. Looks like these charts actually aren't, which maybe means these aren't the most accessible. This probably could use some auditing of accessibility in order to focus on these pieces of these bar charts here to see more data. So yeah, I think I saw Marcy comment on some high charts, accessible charts. Maybe those would be good to look into for something like this. Okay, so there's a form. Let's test and see if we can actually submit anything through this at gatsbyjs.com. When I hit enter, we're seeing, okay, this isn't sending the data anywhere, but I can see in the URL here that it is indeed, it might be small text, but it's adding my email with whatever I typed in there. So if we were to implement a place where that form were to post to, we could start saving this. So neat. Any other questions up to this point, Obina? Anything you're seeing?
Yeah. So someone is asking, is it possible to use Headless CMS's, use Markdown, MDX with Headless CMS?
That's actually an interesting question. Yeah, there are some headless CMSs that implement similar kind of behaviors in different ways. I'm not actually aware of a headless CMS that uses MDX now. It's possible there is. Maybe there's team members in the chat that know more about that. I know like sanity.io, for example, uses a similar style called portable text, where they can add in their own components into what you're authoring that feels similar to MDX. I'm not aware of any headless CMSs though now that implement MDX as we kind of use it like this.
Yeah, and also the follow up to that question, someone same person also asked how do you get someone that already knows Markdown to be able but does not understand or is able to add MDX files. So I think the important thing is that MDX is almost the same. It's the same thing as Markdown. It just helps you to have like some interactivity in your MD file, and then you could import components into it. So if someone already has like a knowledge of Markdown, then yeah, definitely MDX would just be a plus on that.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
I agree. I think to add on to what Obina said, there's also other things that can kind of help someone familiar with Markdown to use MDX. One thing is you can actually, you can configure an option in Gatsby Plugin MDX that allows you to still use Markdown files. So essentially, if I set up my options here to look for extensions.mdx and .md, that means Gatsby Plugin MDX will look for MDX files and Markdown files. And if they're written in normal Markdown, they'll still operate fine. Nothing will break. But it gives someone that maybe does understand MDX the ability to utilize it. So that's another option too. If it feels like something that may be scary to someone who is afraid of learning something new, or maybe has yet to start understanding how the pieces work, you can add that extension to the plugin and continue to just write Markdown files. And then if someone that does want to use MDX can, they're able to. So that might be a bit of a compromise there. Okay. Well, to keep going, that shows several things here. So now we have on our site, this is coming from an MDX file. We have some generic content, a chart, more generic content. In line, we have this form that can be submitted from, and then some more generic content. This is so far what we've implemented is really importing components, adding them to our site. from a third-party package or library and importing, and then from our own custom component and importing. There's other features of MDX that can configure things a little more for more advanced use cases. We can go through a couple of those. One of those being adding additional page like metadata or structured data to our site in the form of what's called Frontmatter. So that's also a similar thing in Markdown that's also available in MDX. Another thing we can look at here is adding shortcodes or kind of like shortcuts to importing components, making them globally available in all MDX sites. You can run through that and a couple other things. So for starters, I guess to explain, Frontmatter is a concept used in Markdown and also in MDX that allows us to have more structured content inside of each of our MDX files. So in Markdown or MDX, it looks the same. It looks like 3 dashes wrapping a key like a title and then some sort of value for it, like a string. So a blog post title. Let's capitalize that. So Frontmatter just wraps keys to values that allow you to store more, what's more structured. If we want each of our MDX files to have a title and an author and maybe some tags associated with what we're writing on this page, we can do that at a place like here, and that makes this data easier to access if we want to either run sort of programmatic page creation from these files. If I wanted to loop through a folder full of MDX files and find only the ones that have tags, like we could give this all sorts of tags like for learning, documentation. And maybe I want to loop through a folder of 50 MDX files and find all the ones that are tagged with documentation, and then create pages in one part of my site for those, and pages in another part of my site for another one. Adding Frontmatter allows us structured access to content related to the site. We could create things that are sorted based on titles or dates when things were created. So adding Frontmatter gives more rigidity to some of the data we're adding in here. This is actually a pretty common thing in Markdown. At least I've seen it several places with other different Markdown authored documents. So when we're using Frontmatter in an MDX file, it appears at the very top before any imports. It also appears at the top in Markdown if you're writing in Markdown on a Gatsby site. And then it can be accessed in one specific way that is outlined, I believe, in I think it's a Writing MDX Pages doc. Let's open up this and see how it instructs us to use this. So this is on the Gatsby docs about using MDX in a Gatsby site. We have several guides on different kind of behaviors or things you'd like to implement. What we just covered, importing and using components, is also covered here. But there's some information in here that would be interesting now. So here in this first section, using Frontmatter and MDX, it says, by default, Gatsby Plugin MDX supports Frontmatter, so you can define things like titles and paths. So these can be used in GraphQL queries and are declared at the beginning of your MDX document. So you're using a title, a path, a date. We've only got a few things, but we'll see what else they tell us here. So it's available, like this says. It can be queried or made available in props.pagecontext.frontmatter. It can be accessed in blocks of JSX in your MDX document. So blocks of JSX are those, basically the React tags, the places where we're using pieces of React in our MDX. The props is a React term for information we are providing to another component. So MDX is providing props with this page context and the Frontmatter that it gathers to this page that we could access. So let's go ahead and copy this little example too. We already have a title, but let's add an author. Go up to our Frontmatter and add this here. And then we can Just copy the same little thing they're using in this example. Say we wanted to add an H1 with our title, a blog post title, fitting name, and then a span for the author, Jay Gatsby. I suppose, you know what, that's me. I'm the author. I'm going to change that. And saving this should say when we find this Frontmatter, it should pass these props into our MDX file, and then they should be available here. I think we may actually need to restart our server, but let's see if this just ran. Okay, I'm not seeing it. So what I think is happening here, when I run Gatsby develop again, this should work. But Gatsby Plugin MDX will, each time it runs, it's looking through this file and finding this data, things like this, or finding these components and making sure it knows how to deal with them. In this case, I needed to restart my server because the plugin is not actually watching for those changes as we're developing. So when I run Gatsby develop again, it'll look through this file and say, okay, we have Frontmatter this time. Let's make sure we pass that into the page and provide all of this information inside props.pagecontext.frontmatter. So this time when I go back there, yep, there we go. We have a blog post title coming from the props, the Frontmatter for the title, and then my name right there, passed into the span. So we can actually open up the browser tools here. I'll make this a little bigger. But we can see that MDX isn't doing anything too different at the end of the day. If I select any of these elements, we'll see this is just an H1, like we saw back in these slides at the beginning. We wrote content as a title. Well, I actually wrote that as an H1, so that's probably an unfair example. But the span coming in, a text just rendered as a P tag, our figure with the chart. Later on, another P tag, our form with the label and its input. So these things are just HTML at the end of the day. After MDX handles them, it outputs them the way that we've specified. And it's got this cool interactive content inside of that other content. So that's using Frontmatter and adding some more structured data to things. Any questions in regards to any of this that we're running into? Let's see. Okay, I'm seeing any other questions you've seen, Obina, in this chat?
Yeah, I just answered the question about passing props in MDX. So yes, you can pass props in MDX because it is in its core functionality. So yeah, that could work.
Neat, yeah, that question that can props be easily passed and customized for any post. Okay, great. Well, that's Frontmatter. Another neat feature of MDX is shortcodes. So that'd be probably one that several people could be interested in. So let's see how that would be addressed. That was actually in a recent 100 Days of Gatsby challenge. That was a suggestion, was adding MDX to your site and then using shortcodes to make components available in all pages. So what a shortcode is, I believe the term was made popular by WordPress. It could have been used elsewhere, but a shortcode refers to using the name of a component to have a shortcut to using it. Essentially, shortcode, kind of like a shortcut. At least that's the way I think of it. So in our case here, in this file, if I went and created a new page, let's actually just do that. My second post.mdx, in order for me to use this chart and this form, I would need to import them at the top of the file again. This would start to get tedious if I have hundreds of blog posts or multiple authors continually contributing to our blog or our site in different ways. So in order to facilitate a smoother authoring process in regards to this, we can set up MDX to make these components globally available in any MDX file. That means we wouldn't need to say in each place, import chart from React Charts, import form from components/form. They'd be automatically imported for us, and we can simply or we can write out just the name of the component. So in order to do that, let's refer to the docs and see how they teach this, because they generally do a better job than I do. If we go back to Gatsby Plugin MDX, there's, I believe, an explanation of shortcodes. Linking here, if you want to allow usage of a component from anywhere, often referred to as a shortcode, you can pass it to the MDX Provider. Now, MDX Provider is something we haven't seen or run into yet. It's actually something that is implemented by Gatsby Plugin MDX. And we didn't need to learn the details of it because the plugin sets this MDX Provider up for us. But we're able to configure one ourselves if we want to extend some more of the functionality. So like this example shows, we can create an MDX Provider inside of a layout file and then add shortcodes, which it says then makes them available without an import. So to break down this example, we see this is source components layout.js. We have a similar looking file. We have source components layout.js. That's wrapping our site like we mentioned before. And this pattern here with the provider, this is something that you may have run into in React or may see in React in different places. The notion of a provider where a component called a provider lives as a parent element to its children or child components, like we see here, children. The term provider actually denotes sort of what it's doing. It's providing additional functionality to components below it. So MDX Provider, by extension, is providing MDX functionality to tes children elements, or MDX pages that are beneath this layout. So when we have our MDX files wrapped by our layout and we add a provider to it, we'll be able to add additional MDX functionality that gets provided to each of these pages by the one provider. So whoops, that was the wrong thing. So we'll go back to that example. So we'll implement this much the same way. We'll go to our layout file, add an MDX provider that wraps all of our MDX pages, and then provide whatever specific shortcodes or components. In their case, it's a link, a YouTube component, a Twitter component, and this tomato box component. In our case, this will be a chart and a form that we add here. So we'll do something similar to this. So let's open up our layout file. And at the top, we'll need to do the same thing. We'll have to import the MDX provider from mdx.js/react. Let's add that. Have the MDX provider available now. Then we need to import our components. In our case, that was, I'll put this down here, our form from components/form, and our chart. Import chart from React charts. So these imports should look much the same as what we saw here, the way we imported them in this file. So we can actually remove these now because we're going to set this up so that we don't need them. So with the MDX provider, our components imported, let's refer back to these docs. We can create an object of shortcodes, or we could pass them in right here. Let's create an object much like they do. Const shortcodes equals an object of our form and our chart. The shortcodes contain those, and we'll need to wrap the whole thing in this MDX provider. So let's go down to what's actually rendered. In this case, there's our header, there's the footer. We need all of this, specifically this children content, to be wrapped by the MDX provider. So we could add this really anywhere. I'll add it here and replace this React fragment. These empty tags are a React concept called a fragment, where you can render something without actually creating a tag in HTML. So when this layout's rendered, it will render a header, a div, a main, a footer, but it won't actually render what's here. In our case, we'll change this to an MDX provider. So I'll update those. Then we need to make sure this MDX provider has the functionality we want to provide to the children, which is this components prop, which has these shortcodes. So let's say MDX provider has components. We'll make that our shortcodes. And when I save here and go back to my first post here, save this file now with the imports removed, but our chart and form still being used. Go back to the site, and upon refreshing, we see that those are still working. To test this out on another page, let's go over to my second post and say, here's our form. Please consider signing up. Might as well be courteous. And now we should be able to use the form without importing it. So we'll go to the page that got created there, / my second post. And there it is. Here's our form. Please consider signing up. The same form used on our first post page. And without having to import this. So the same thing is available if we wanted to render that chart again. The chart would be accessible, or the chart would be capable of being used here without an import. When Gatsby Plugin MDX runs and we have these shortcodes here, it sort of does the work for us, saying, okay, I have these components as shortcodes, and each of my MDX files, let's make sure there's an import added behind the scenes so that the user doing this doesn't have to. This is also maybe another way of addressing the concern about helping an author use MDX that may be unfamiliar with it or hasn't used it before. Using shortcodes gives them a sort of a step into using it without having to understand how imports work. So if they've ever seen HTML, the JSX that React uses could look similar enough to maybe get started. So that's that. Hey, one last thing, unless there's other questions, is another concept here in the writing pages in MDX guide explains that I think has some interesting implications, is a section here in our table of contents, exporting page metadata. So there's several things we can do where MDX files allow additional functionality to come by exporting pieces of JavaScript. And one of those in this case is providing additional data for a document by exporting page metadata, is the way this is outlined or explained. So if we present a sort of hypothetical scenario where, say in my blog here, I have multiple charts that are all using this same data, and I don't want this big long chart component kind of making it hard to read my content here, or I have to keep copying and pasting all this data into multiple components. I could pull this little array out here into what sort of turns like into a variable for MDX and pass that into multiple charts. So to show what this is doing, this kind of explains that data exported MDX documents can be made available on a variable name you've assigned it to. Sort of like assigning a variable in JavaScript or in other programming languages. We're saving some sort of data or data structure into a variable name, like this. Like in JavaScript, you would say const names. In MDX, we export a variable equal to whatever we want to save it to. So in my case, with this data, I could cut this data, come down to the bottom of my file, and export a const called data, and then paste that same thing in. That makes this data variable accessible to pieces of JSX inside my MDX. I'm able to use that in other places. So in my case here, I would instead just pass in data to this chart. Oops, I deleted the whole thing. So in this case, when I go back here, we should see the exact same data being rendered there. But if I had another chart down here, maybe I have vertical bar charts and a line chart that wants to use the same data, I could store that in this variable and then pass that in both places. So, are there any other questions we're running into in our chat here? Or let's see. Context, definitely powerful. Can definitely do some crafty stuff in Gatsby Node. Variables is way under data. Hey, glad that helped answer some more. This same concept of exporting page metadata can be used to actually define other layouts. This is something maybe worth reading up on. We provided a default layout in our Gatsby config, but say I wanted to provide a more specific layout to my page here, I could, on a one-off basis inside my page, export a different layout for this page to use. That's another concept. The docs in here on writing MDX pages run through several different applications, including programmatically creating pages or using different MDX plugins. And then there's even sections on stuff like Markdown syntax and understanding what Markdown is, kind of what we went through. So if you're interested in sort of diving into more applications of MDX, I think these are a great place to start for that. So what we've come to now is we have our full site here with these posts. They don't look particularly eye-catching, in my opinion, but I think there's a very interesting thing happening here that makes these pretty special. And that is the fact that I have this layout of interactive content across all my pages that's consistent for all of them. I have now some static content with some structured data here. I have an interactive chart that I can refer to and dive into more data. I have a call to action in the middle of this content that allows a user to actually sign up if they want to, and the ability to do that on multiple pages and author this quickly without having to import things all over the place. So we've come a decent way here. So we have this question just came up in this chat. Are there any drawbacks of using MDX? That's a great question, and I think a very important question whenever you're evaluating any technology. So to address this, I think the drawbacks of using MDX may be, like mentioned in the chat, maybe it's something that's unfamiliar, it's new. So that could be a potential drawback if you're looking into MDX. Another thing is if you're using a headless CMS, like another previous question, there's a chance that headless CMS doesn't have functionalities to using MDX. And you may, if you're switching to a new headless CMS, find that some people aren't capable of handling it. One note in regards to these default imports that are actually solvable problems, but because MDX is a newer package, that does mean you may encounter bugs that others haven't. Being a newer technology, it's possible that functionality in MDX is less stable than the more battle-tested Markdown, I suppose. In this example of using an MDX provider, by providing these components to all my pages, I've done a great thing because I make it easier to import my components everywhere. But I've also added a decent bit of overhead to each of my pages in terms of letting them load. Because the way MDX is implemented now, these components are added to each page, adding a bit of a potential load time and performance hit, which is probably something that could be resolved with fancy tree shaking or engineering concepts that are beyond me, but I feel like that's probably in the future. Any other questions people are curious about or wondering why we did something a certain way, or general questions about MDX? I've seen that MDX wraps components in div. Is this still the case? I don't believe in every case that would be the case. I think that MDX will render, well, like Markdown does, if it sees a set of like a paragraph here, it'll render this as a paragraph. I'm not sure particularly if what that question may refer to, but I believe it should render similar to Markdown, whatever it's told to render. In this case, this would be a paragraph. If you give it a specific HTML element, a span, though it's possible I could be wrong. But that does cover all of the information we wanted to cover. So thanks for everyone joining us, and hopefully you learned something of value.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Our presenters were Kyle Gill and Obinna Ekwuno. My name is Caitlin Cashin. Kyle and Obinna are both findable on Twitter, and we will have another stream coming up on March 19th, probably sometime in the afternoon Eastern time. So stay tuned for more info on that. We hope you'll join us, and thanks for joining today.
Yep, thanks everyone.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Yep.